called Educating CPE Supervisors, and that was of 11 people named as best in the country at providing supervisory education. And so the outcome of that study was that those supervisors tended to continue to use CPE processes for their own consultation and development. The second study was mutually engaged supervisory processes. That was a study of 19 newly certified associate supervisors who described the processes they used to learn to do CPE supervision. This third study is going to the Journal of Pastoral Care and Counseling today, and hopefully the three will come together. There's more work to be done on that to create a theory that will guide us in providing supervisory education. The reason we need that kind of theory is because all of us who are certified supervisors were certified based on our competence with level 1 and level 2 CPE students. We have obviously no requirement for demonstrating competence in supervisory CPE before taking on SESs. To add another level of certification seems impractical, so along with task forces in ACPE looking at how we will do this, we did in this study try to find the behavioral outcomes of supervisory CPE that will guide the supervisors as well as the students. Oh my goodness, so I forgot that I had this slide. We've already talked about these things. I also wanted to say, and this will be in the article, the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education said their competencies were too theoretical to be practical, or an article quoted somebody named Tim Kate. I'm not sure how he pronounces it. The article is by Green and came out in 2009. The competencies for medical education were too theoretical to be practical. The medical specialties, particularly I know internal medicine and pediatrics, defined milestones. And in this article, they have a chart that names competencies, milestones, specific behaviors for each milestone, approximate time frame to learn the behaviors, and evaluation strategies. We are not at that point in this study. We at this point are naming behaviors for each of the categories the study defined that go with our competencies. Clearly, it would be great if we could come up with approximate time frames for learning each behavior and ways to evaluate those. I just wanted you to know, in terms of cognate disciplines, we are not alone. The research method that we used was grounded theory. It's a qualitative method that studies the experience of the question under review. The people that we went to find out what are the behavioral outcomes for supervisory CPE were the certification commissioners during the period of time of this study. So 28 of the possible 30 certification commissioners consented to be interviewed. The interviews were done individually by me. I had them professionally transcribed, edited them, and then, well, let me tell you what the interview question was. It was, what are the behaviors you look for either in the materials, so this is the candidate's materials when they go up for associate supervisor. Associate supervisor, of course, is the end of the supervisory education process, the outcome that we hope for. So what are the behaviors you certification commissioners look for either in the materials, on the DVD, I know now we're calling this the digital recording, I believe, or in the committee appearance itself for people going up for associate supervisor that influence you to vote to grant or to deny, but we went mostly with grant. The analysis is 3 different levels of coding, which I'm happy to talk with you about if you're interested. Saturation is the grounded theory method that says as we keep doing the analysis of the interviews and continue with the interview process, we are not coming up with any new information. So that means this question of what are the behaviors we look for at the point of associate supervisor status, that we've been saturated with that information. Member check is taking the results of the analysis back to the 28 commissioners who participated in the interview process and saying, does this look like what you believe are the behaviors? Is there anything missing? So we had several people respond to the member check. We asked everyone, and we did change a couple things. We added a couple of things based on what the certification members responded. And so I presented the results of this study in May, but we have done a whole lot more work with the analysis, so you'll see some differences if you heard that talk. The coding team, so the research team for this study were Chuck Orme-Rogers. Chuck is an everybody here, let me not go on about that, everybody here is an ACPE supervisor. Chuck is the Advanced Care Planning Coordinator as well as CPE Supervisor and Palliative Care Team member at Meritor Unity Point Health in Madison, Wisconsin. Johnny Bush is a 30-year ordained missionary Baptist, senior pastor of the Greater Faith Baptist Church of Stamford, Connecticut. And Johnny has, just in the last 2 or 3 weeks, joined the Westchester Medical Center in Valhalla, New York. He's their ACPE supervisor. Sheryl Lyndes Stowman is a chaplain and CPE supervisor at the University of Minnesota Medical Center in Minneapolis, which is part of the Fairview system. She's also adjunct faculty member of United Theological Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, and a trained spiritual director. Rod Seeger had been supervising since 1975. And Rod, for 31 years, was with the San Francisco Medical Center. He was the director of spiritual care services there. So each of these interviews was coded by at least 2 of us. Some interviews were coded by all 5 of us, and we would compare what we heard in the interviews. The purpose of that is not to take away bias. That's kind of hard to do when talking about supervisory CPE with 5 CPE supervisors, but to make sure we heard as deeply as we could what the commissioners were saying about what they looked for. The results. The study participants, let's see here, 28 of the 28 people who agreed to participate, 17 were men and 11 women, 21 European American, 3 African American, 2 European American and Native American, 1 Asian Indian, 1 African naturalized American. The participants, these are the commissioners, ranged in age from 43 to 75. The average age was 59. All 9 regions of ACPE had at least 2 certification commissioners responding. Let's see, 28 participants averaged 7.5 years serving on regional certification. The span was between 3 and 15 years, and they averaged 5.1 years serving on the Certification Commission. The span was between 12.5 years and half a year. The thinking here is no matter how long they've been on the Certification Commission, they are voting at the point of associate supervisor. So we wanted everyone's participation and perspective. The participants were from 14 Christian denominations, 1 Jewish denomination, 1 African traditional spirituality practitioner. So we identified, doing the analysis of these 28 interviews, 12 key categories. The behaviors are not in the order of importance or chronology. Many of the behaviors are woven in the candidate's materials, the DVD, and the committee appearance. So it's not like all the behaviors you're going to hear all need to be expressed or all need to be expressed in one place. I'll tell you that I am going to go through the 12 key categories and tell you 2 or 3 behaviors in each category. There are more than 80 behaviors in these categories. Obviously, it's impossible to go through them all now. I'm going to submit them in the article we have written and hope and pray that the Journal of Pastoral Care and Counseling is willing to publish them all. If not, we will certainly find a way to get them to you. The purpose here is to inform the SESs, candidates, what you're aiming toward, and the supervisors providing supervision for supervisory students. I'm sorry about saying supervision 9 times in a sentence. All right, the first competency is conceptual. The first behavior uses theory in the SES's own way. And so here I'm using SES as something that includes everybody is an SES. Candidates, of course, are advanced SESs preparing to go for associate. But what we hope for in these categories is that this will inform supervisory education from the beginning throughout the process. So I didn't want to just say candidate as though we don't want to be paying attention. I know theory is kind of hard early in supervisory education, but at least have an eye toward how we're modeling this as supervisors and guiding the SES along the way. So the behaviors: explain theories in terms understandable to those unfamiliar with the theories. Explains the theory as the SES has incorporated it into his or her thinking and practice, as well as from the theorist's own point of view. So what we're looking for here, what the commissioner's looking for, is an in-depth understanding of the theory that is fully owned in the practice of the candidate. That the candidate is able to explain different elements of his or her curriculum through the lens of each theory. Why do you do verbatim? What does your personality theory tell you about the way you're using verbatim with this particular student about this particular issue? What about your didactics? How does your theology, your education theory inform your choice of didactics? So to practice talking about that, so that when they get up for certification, this is something that they have experience explaining. Quote on the use of theory: I'm looking for a student who can succinctly articulate key concepts of their theoretical framework, how they use those concepts specifically to assess what the CPE students' learning needs are, and to craft appropriate interventions, and then to modify their practice and supervision when an intervention does not go as hoped. All of the quotes in this presentation are going to be from the certification commissioners. All of the behaviors are going to be what they are looking for from the candidate. The next behavior: assesses the CPE students' learning needs. The behaviors here: assess the CPE student's learning needs and gifts using the language of his or her theories. Give an example of educationally assessing a CPE student whose worldview is different from the candidate's own. So just like, at least for those of us supervising in residency programs, we're doing a whole lot with spiritual assessment. The commissioners are looking for the candidate to be assessing their CPE students. This is not, I haven't looked carefully at the new standards, but I don't know that this is an outcome we're naming for supervisory CPE. It's a practice the commissioners are looking for and something the candidates need to learn to do, at least in our program, as early as beginning SESs, right? This is another piece of assessing and of bringing word of description of the students into certification. One of the commissioners said, it's amazing how in materials I've read as a supervisor and as a commissioner, people are general in their description. They're not specific. And candidates tell people what they've done, they don't show. They have to obtain the delicious details of the encounter. It's like bringing me into the experience with them. So this is something that can be practiced throughout, being as specific as possible, describing the students and the work the candidates are doing with their students. Evaluation is a huge part of assessment. Commissioner said, I'll be looking at the candidate's evaluation of their CPE students in terms of whether the candidate identifies the strengths of their students and their growing edges. Does the candidate really point out, in terms of evaluating a CPE student's caregiving, where they see strengths and growing edges. The next behavioral category describes underlying reasons for behavior. So describing the motivation for behavior and dynamics of the candidate CPE students using the language of the candidate's theories. Showing how the candidate unpacks a dynamic, for example, by saying, this is what happened, this is why I think it happened, and this was my contribution to this particular dynamic. Next competency, supervisory, develops individual or group supervisory alliances. The behaviors here focus relationship with students on the CPE students' education for providing spiritual care. I presented this at the Mid-Atlantic region and got some feedback where somebody said, isn't this kind of a given? No, I'm sorry to say it is not a given. Sometimes the CPE candidate will be focusing their CPE students' experience around understanding themselves more deeply, around the relationships within the group, how does the group relate to one another, without connecting that back to what difference does that make in spiritual care. So here the supervisory relationship with the individual supervisor, so in IS, as well as in the group work, is focused on the student's education for providing spiritual care. This is another big one. Teaching the CPE students how they're developing self-awareness helps them become better spiritual care providers. Some students get quite taken with the whole CPE process of helping them understand themselves and their families and their faith more deeply. And some candidates don't help them make that connection to why all of this self-understanding makes a difference in how they provide better spiritual care. The quote from the commissioner, the candidate focused on what she had learned about herself, how that fit with her own theoretical framework, and how those frameworks helped her understand her own internal dynamics. But listen to how she tied that into her work with the student. It's as though the candidate said, and the commissioner had not remembered this, of course, verbatim, having gone through this myself gave me some empathy and insight into my student with whom I had some real tension and conflict. Here's how I used my own self, my own identity, and how I used my theoretical framework to build a stronger supervisory alliance with that student. Guiding students, so guiding the candidate is guiding their CPE students in the use of emotion in ministry. So of course emotion is huge in CPE. The candidate describes how he or she guides his or her students to identify their own emotions and teaches their CPE students to reflect on how the emotion of a patient or congregant impacts the CPE student's ministry. So if the CPE student goes in and is working with a patient that's really angry, how does that impact the CPE student's ability to provide spiritual care? The candidate is talking about and giving specific examples about how they teach that. A quote on guiding CPE student to bring self-awareness into ministry practice. So the commissioner says, I might say, you gave an elegant description of the student's psychodynamic process, and that helped me gain some real insight into the student and the struggles he or she was having in the learning process. But I was interested in hearing how that insight helped you supervise their practice of ministry. Some of the commissioners lifted more than once that moving from the insight the candidate had into their students and helping the students gain that level of insight needed to be better connected. The candidate needed to help their CPE student connect that to the practice of ministry. I think some of us can get distracted and sort of absorbed in the psychological or the sociological, but the bottom line for the commissioner is the CPE student developing his or her pastoral identity? So the bottom line for the commissioner is the candidate helping their CPE students develop pastoral identity? Is the candidate helping their CPE students develop competence as a spiritual caregiver? Frankly, huge importance for all of us doing supervisory education, learning it or providing it. Frankly, a lot of candidates have a hard time articulating that at the associate level. Here I reference Amy Green's study. How do people learn to articulate this? They present as often as possible, so by the time they get to certification, they're very familiar with giving voice to how they are helping their students develop pastoral identity and develop competence as spiritual care providers. The next behavior, wait, I've gotten my things confused here, explores theological and cultural diversity. The behaviors, and there's several of these, but I want to highlight these two, helps the CPE students talk about how their cultures, their religions, or their religious practices, their spirituality, their ethnicities are informing or hindering their understanding of the patients or the congregants they serve. And the candidate is modeling the importance of respecting different worldviews. This is a great quote from a commissioner on religious diversity. Can the candidate enter into the world, can the liberal candidate enter into the world of a fundamentalist student, fundamentalist CPE student, and help them articulate a theology at the bedside that is appropriate for them, rather than imposing a more liberal relational point of view on them? Can they use the student's own meaning-making abilities and the student's rules for meaning-making in a way that helps them relate to the other? I would love to stop and unpack this, and I don't know that we have time. So here's the next quote on respecting the student's worldview. The commissioner would want the candidate to be helping their CPE students to become much more aware and conscious of the ways in which their worldview impacts the way they do spiritual care, especially if they're in the majority religion. We spend so much time talking with our candidates and having them talk with their CPE students about understanding their own faith. This suggests that we may need to do some more work helping our candidates understand the faith practices of their CPE students, and the parallel and there is helping the CPE students do a much better job understanding the faith practices of their patients and families. That may not be as important for people that are staying in the congregation, but as Wendy Cadge is helping us see, it is enormously important for those of us educating chaplains, and therefore, since so much supervisory education and so much supervision is done in the medical setting, it's very important in supervisory CPE. The next behavior, develop spiritual care competencies. The behaviors here are two of the several behaviors. Helps the CPE students articulate what it means for them to grow into identity as spiritual care providers. The candidate helps their CPE students develop skills such as providing crisis ministry and relating professionally with an interdisciplinary care team. As you can imagine, there could be a list of things that the candidates help their students develop. One of the things we learned doing this study is not only is the process essential, the content is also essential in supervisory CPE. The next behavioral category facilitates the CPE student group reflection. This was a big one for the commissioners. The candidate is facilitating all CPE students participating in the group. They are teaching the group to engage in connected conversation. So within the context of not just verbatim seminar, but whatever people call their their what we call IPR, some IPG, some call it non-agenda group or covenant group. How are the students learning to engage in connected conversation? And how is the candidate showing or able to talk about providing intentional progression of interventions? So at the beginning of the student group, do the interventions look any different as the candidate begins the group than at the end? What are their CPE students able to do that the candidate has helped them learn to do in groups so that their interventions are different than they were at the beginning of the group? I really wish I could see your faces to see if that's making sense. Here's a quote from a commissioner. The DVD needs to demonstrate the beginning and the ending of the particular group that's being presented, so I can see that the candidate is attending to the formation of that particular session, an active but not controlling participation of the candidate. Of course, there's a world of room for judgment there, but the candidate needs to be able to say, this is why I was doing what I was doing. That they have some awareness of the group process and they're not practicing individual supervision in the group process. That was another big one, another behavior that came up a lot, that the commissioners wanted to see that candidates knew the difference between group supervision and doing individual supervision within the group. Next competence, collegiality. Collegial, focuses committee process on certification. The commissioners felt strongly from many commissioners that the candidate needs to take responsibility for focusing on certification in the committee. If the candidate is not sure they have demonstrated competence in each of the areas, they need to be in conversation with the commissioners about that. There are about 11 behaviors that the commissioners were looking for in the certification process. A consistent, strong one is that they expected the candidate to be able to stop the committee process to reflect when they got stuck. Two things here, not unusual for people to get stuck in the context of meeting a committee. Secondly, the candidate needs to have the authority, the personal supervisory authority and the collegial competence to say, wait a minute, I need to stop and regroup and think about what I want to do next, think about what's happening here. That is actually a behavior that demonstrated competence. Quote on the committee appearance. If a candidate can engage around learning issues in the committee comfortably and take a new idea and pull it alongside their own theory, and you can see the critical purchase piece happening right there in the committee, that's very powerful, because that's what you have to do with students. The idea being that a student might very well throw a supervisor an idea they haven't thought of before, and can they stop and engage it? If the candidate can do that in the committee with another supervisor, then I'm assuming they will be engaged in doing that with their CPE students as well. This was a huge theme that came up in this study, that the commissioners expect that supervision is hard. And so if the candidate is able to talk about and use supervisory practices in their meeting, in a high-stress meeting with commissioners, then they believe the candidate will be able to be that in tune with him or herself and able to provide good supervision in those very difficult moments that arrive with students or in groups. The next behavioral category expresses relational authority. The behaviors here are that the candidate is able to explain his or her work with the depth of theoretical and experiential understanding that allows for conversation in the committee, but does not devolve into people-pleasing behaviors with committee members. One of the difficult things, because supervision is hard, one of the difficult things are that some of these behaviors are processes. This behavior is a process. There's several pieces to this behavior. the depth of theoretical and experiential understanding that allows for conversation. So this is an engaged experience that the candidates are entering into with the commissioners. There's a relationship happening with the commissioners in the context of this behavior. The candidate uses theory to support or critique his or her actions in supervision, rather than using theory as a defense. So again, this is a process. Quote on supervisory authority. In sort of a counterintuitive way, some of being able to demonstrate supervisory authority is being able to talk about what you don't know and where you struggle, where you're ambiguous, as well as what you do know and what is working. And I think to do that in a group can be very empowering for the supervisor and also empowering for the student. So the commissioner is taking an example of talking about a candidate being able to talk about where they struggle and taking it back into, if a candidate can do that with the commissioners, the idea is that they can also do that in a group of their CPE students, and that to do that in a group of CPE students can be empowering for the supervisor, empowering in the sense of freeing to acknowledge not having it all together, but also empowering for that person's CPE students who realize, okay, my supervisor struggles. The fact that I'm struggling does not mean that I can't be competent and am not able to provide spiritual care. Again, even this quote has several layers of process. Our research group thought that ACPE should strongly consider re-including integration as an ACPE supervisory competency. It apparently used to be a supervisory competency, and it came up in the conversation of every single certification commissioner as something that is core in certifying an associate supervisor. Connects theory, practice, and personhood is the category. The behaviors describes how he or she draws on theory, supervisory experience, life story, faith or religious tradition or theology, and respect for diversity to supervise. So you hear the several strands that need to be at the disposal of the supervisory candidate. And again, this doesn't have to be an example of drawing on all of these in one story, but these are all elements that the commissioners expect the candidate to be able to draw on as they describe supervision. Easily describes how theory informs supervisory practice, including assessment of students, interventions, evaluation, and development of curriculum. Easily is the word here that suggests integration. And again, both of these behaviors are the results of many, many, many times practicing to do this. And I see right now that my slide is a mess because it says he or she or he, so I'm sorry about that, but there's nothing to do about it now. Anyway, this is one of the integration behaviors. Quote on integrated supervision: the commissioner would want the candidate to be able to say in their analysis of the group they present, when so-and-so said this, it really touched me deeply and it moved me to a place, well, it angered me and I had to really supervise myself. I had to make use of my theory in order to respond in this way to this student. And then I had to go back and reflect on it. So this is the level of integration that the candidate is so aware of when she or he gets hooked, why they got hooked, and how to shift from being hooked to providing supervision for the student in that moment using theory. I don't know about you, but some of these behaviors, I've been certified for about 25 years, and this is an area where I really continue to have to work. So it's not that this all has to be perfect, but the candidate has to be able to talk about this kind of process, what they do with it, and how they go back and reflect on it. Continuing to use the CPE process for one's own development. The behaviors here, the candidate is able to describe how her or his supervisory approach is evolving based on work with theory or experience. I will say a couple of the supervisors said it seems like somehow candidates think once their papers have passed, they are ready to meet the committee. Not so. The theory papers are passed, and now how is the candidate working to integrate theories in supervision, or probably for most candidates, continuing to work on integrating theory with supervision. And the theory, as it integrates with supervision, doesn't just change the supervision, it also changes the candidate's use of theory. So this concept of continuing to more deeply understand theory is something that the commissioners were looking for in the certification process. And also, the commissioners voiced an awareness that being certified at the associate level or at the ongoing supervisory development. Limitations of this research study. Behaviors are awfully hard to describe in a way that captures animation. So there is some concern, I've heard, because I've presented this now several places, supervisors say, you know, what if folks just go out and try to like act out these behaviors without achieving the level of integration so that the behaviors are organic, or organic, I guess would be the correct pronunciation of that word. That's a limitation of the study. We identified behaviors, but I don't know of a way to really give full voice to the spirit that would animate the behavior. Certain questions were not addressed. How do candidates include multicultural humility material in their curricula? So things like, how do you know a candidate is really able to model respect for other worldviews? What might that look like in their curriculum? What might that, you know, so what are some ways that we could really get at a candidate's ability to respect different theologies and different cultures? This study didn't get into that. How candidates help their CPE students learn to provide, and I'm sorry, this should say spiritual care, for a wide variety of faith traditions and practices. We did not go into that in this study. I'm sure there are other limitations to the study, but those are the ones that we're aware of in terms of this research project. Well, another limitation I'm aware of right this minute is we certainly didn't get to the place of how might these behaviors be developed in an SES, how long might they take, and how might we in supervisory education evaluate whether a candidate is able to produce these behaviors so we know if they're ready for certification. How might the candidate know that, him or herself? Implications of this study. Develop and practice these behaviors as a focus for supervisory educational processes, using some of the processes from another study. Help the candidate shift the focus from themselves to their students. This in-depth attention to self that CPE provides needs to not get stuck with the candidate's deeper self-understanding, but help them move toward providing that level of education to their students. And that self-awareness that's created in CPE needs to move toward ministry for the CPE students, better informed ministry, and supervision for the candidates. So applying the self-awareness in practice. Supervisors of SESs and candidates, we believe, need to continue using CPE practices for our own development. Just like we said at the last behavior for supervisory candidates becoming associate supervisors, how do we, providing supervisory education, continue to work on our own integration so that we can, and our own theory, and our own practice, so that we can provide better informed supervision for our SESs and our candidates. Oh, good, here we are right at the end. Thank you to the certification commissioners who participated so generously in this study. They were very patient with me as I continued to say, but what does that behavior look like? To Rod and Johnny and Sheryl and Chuck for their wonderful work coding and discussing what we were all seeing in the interviews. This was all, as so much of CPE is, volunteer work based on their commitment to this project. None of them received any compensation for doing this in a monetary way. The compensation, we all learned a lot, I believe, about supervisory education, listening to the commissioners' interviews. I would love to thank Bill Scrivener, my former boss of many years, and Camille Chalk, my new boss, who has also voiced a strong commitment to this research, and to Cincinnati Children's Hospital, who allows me to spend time doing this research. And so now Mark will help me know how to hear your questions, which I am happy to do. And I certainly, any of you that want to give feedback about anything you've heard today, it is very timely for you to do that either now or in email or conversation. I would welcome hearing from you because this is for us all, for our community. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Judy. And if anybody has a question, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen when you move your mouse, and you can type in a question, and then Judy will be able to respond to it.
I just mentioned, Mark, that I'm not seeing anything.
Correct. There's nothing there yet.
Oh, okay. All right. We may have lost them all in the context of talking about it.
And also, just so everybody knows, this webinar has been recorded and will also be available on our website at a later date. Okay, one question just came in. Have you compared and contrasted these categories with the CPE supervisor outcomes in the certification manual?
No, we certainly applied them to the, no, we did not. I have looked at those and I thought they were, all right, the short answer is no, and that work should be done. I can feel myself blushing. That would be important work to do.
And then one person asked, how can we access the research article?
Well, first it has to be accepted and published, and I will certainly let you know when that happens. I mean, maybe we can get it to be on the ACPE website that has happened. That may take a little bit of time.
And then will it be possible in the near future to unpack more of these behaviors?
Well, I think that the next step here will be to try to use these in our supervisory education programs. I am certainly going to try to use them in my program, and my new boss has suggested maybe putting together a small group of supervisory students to practice, you know, to see how these behaviors can inform curriculum, and to do that as a research project. So I'm hoping that as people have the behaviors, they might practice with them, and that, to me, that might be the way of unpacking them. I'm certainly open to other suggestions.
Do you think this research will lead to a standardization process for CPE SES curriculum?
I don't know the answer to that. I know there's a lot of work being done by task forces on how we will look at supervisory CPE and how we're looking at certification. And so I think standardization, I know that hopefully these behaviors will inform some of the guidelines we've got. I'm not sure if those will be standardized. I'm not sure.
And then several people have asked about, will they be able to have access to the PowerPoint? Will that be available for them to have?
Well, ideally, they'll let me fix that one slide and send it back to you, but after that, absolutely.
Okay, so we can make the PowerPoint available on our website after Judy sends it back, along with the recording of the webinar for folks.
Yeah.
Another question. I'm wondering if another implication of this research is to continue the CPE learning process intercollegially, say at regional meetings.
That would be a great idea, yes.
How do you think these behaviors connect with professional behaviors that are expected by department managers and the organizations that we work in? Where are the places for integration of CPE supervisor behaviors and corporate professional behaviors? A
great question, and I don't at all mean to be rude. That is not my area of study, and so it probably, I hope somebody else will take this and do that with it, because there certainly are bound to be points of connection, but I have not worked on that.
Anybody else have any questions for Judy? A question just came in. I'm about to submit my theory papers. I have found this webinar extremely valuable at this point in my training. We need more didactic material like this at all levels in the process.
Thank you for that testimonial. I agree.
Do you think there will be a training for commissioners to recognize these outcomes?
Again, I don't at all mean to be disrespectful. The commissioners are the ones that have provided these outcomes through their interviews. So I think that they certainly are interested, I think, in looking at them all together. And I'm not sure how they might choose to engage them, but they brought the wisdom that allowed us to identify these outcomes.
Okay, wonderful. If there are further questions, feel free to email them. You'll get a follow-up email tomorrow, and we'll send some information about how to contact us with additional questions that you might have or thoughts. And we hope that you have enjoyed the presentation today. Thank you to Judy.
And good luck to the person presenting their theory papers. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks everybody for joining us. Have a wonderful day.